As I read off the bios, I'm going to welcome moderator and panelists to the stage. So I will start with our moderator, Dr. Naomi Castro. Naomi Castro is the Senior Director at Career Ladders Project, a nonprofit engaged in equity-minded community college redesign. Naomi provides leadership on CLP initiatives focusing on transitions to college, including dual enrollment, development of pathways, and integrated student support. She holds a bachelor's in history, a teaching credential, and a master's degree in teaching and teacher education from the U of A. Her EDD is from Pepperdine, so when I say doctorate, she is the Dr. Naomi Castro. And she's also an adjunct professor of education at Compton College, so welcome, Naomi Castro. Ben Cheetah is our next guest. Ben is the Chief Deputy Cabinet Secretary from the Office of Governor Newsom. Ben Cheetah is, I just said that part, sorry. Newsom, he has served as the Senior Policy Advisor from Cradle to Career. Previously, it just says Cheetah, but I'm gonna say Ben Cheetah because it sounds so good. Ben Cheetah was an attorney at an international law firm, an attorney advisor to Attorney General Kamala Harris, and a judicial law clerk to federal judges in California and the DC Circuit. Earlier, Ben Cheetah was a third grade teacher and a roofer while attending Continuation High School and community college. So a product of California community colleges, Ben Cheetah. Our next panelist is Linda Collins. Linda is the founder and executive director of Career Ladders Project and provides leadership on educational policy and large-scale reform efforts to close equity gaps in college completion and career advancement. Linda serves as president of the California Edge Coalition Board and as a member of the Linked Learning Alliance Board. Previously, Linda served as president of the Academic Senate for California Community Colleges and taught at Los Medanos College, Santa Rosa Junior College, and San Francisco State University. Welcome, Linda. And our fourth panelist is Dr. Christopher Nellam. He is the Executive Director of Education Trust West, a nonprofit education equity organization focused on educational justice and closing achievement and opportunity gaps for students of color and students from lower income communities from preschool through college. Nellam joined the Education Trust West in October of 2017 and most recently served as the organization's deputy director. Welcome, Christopher Nellam. I will now turn it over to our moderator, Naomi. Here is your state panel.
Thank you. And then just, is this better? Yeah, okay, great. Thank you, friends. And then just as a housekeeping, we're gonna take this panel until 10:35, we'll begin. So Ben, best friend. Yeah. Ben, you play a really important role in setting the educational policy and investment at the governor's office. So why does the governor think that expanding dual enrollment is an important policy move like right now? And how does this figure into the governor's really, really ambitious goal of 70% degree and certificate attainment for working adults by 2030?
Yeah, so I love the question, and so thank you all for having me, and I love the question because of the urgency right behind it. I want to start with my own story and my own sort of journey, because I think it's germane to this overall conversation. So I dropped out of high school my freshman year, and I essentially isolated myself in my room. I pulled down the shades, I slept weird, really odd hours, I was extremely depressed, and I was really, really struggling for about a whole year. One of my most sharpest memories of this is the first time I got outside my room, I was going to a 7-Eleven and I was trying to talk to the cashier, and I kind of had a panic attack because I hadn't talked to anybody in English for so long that I just couldn't get the words out. I say this because I think that we all know people in our immediate or extended family who are going through some version, like young people who are going through some version of this. We are just now starting to talk about it, but it's the reality. After about a year of that, I started roofing, and I started going to continuation high school. So it was independent study, just a couple hours a week. That really helped me kind of figure out a pattern back, sort of a routine, get back outside, kind of just get myself re-socialized a little bit. But at that moment, I was rudderless, I was hopeless, I was feeling worthless, which I think is a very important sort of feeling that a lot of young people feel right now. And it wasn't until my high school teacher was, it was before we used the word dual enrollment, but my high school teacher was like, hey, you could take community college courses. Like, that's an option. And I took him up on that. And that is really when I got to actually imagine myself a better future. That was actually really when I was able to kind of imagine what I was actually motivated towards and what I was working towards. In so many ways, it wasn't until I got to community college that I got to see sort of all the different things that I could potentially do with my life again. I felt like I had like lost everything. And in California, it's one of the only states where that promise is actually real. Like if you go to community college, you have any number of options that you could head off to, including mine, in which a career in policy. So that's all to say, in a lot of ways, I feel this deep in my bones. And this goes to the question around right now. So I think about that question in two ways, the student perspective, but also an institutional perspective. So from the student perspective, I could feel the millions of students and what they're going through. My story is a reflection of a lot of what many young people went through. Just think about it. Disengagement from school, social isolation, does that sound familiar to anybody? Mental health issues, does that sound familiar to anybody? And then trying to figure out what is an educational path that is meaningful to yourself. And that's really the charge that we have to create those paths for all of our students. In a lot of ways, we set up our students for failure because we tell them they have to at every turn we tell them you have to follow your passion. At commencement, we tell them, know what you're gonna be going for. But then not everyone has equitable access to passion or to relevance or knowing what their future might look like. It's we focus so much on material inequity that we oftentimes miss the sort of more important, deeper, almost spiritual inequity that exists, which is how do you even imagine your futures if you've never stepped through the doors of a workplace that you might be your future, or had gotten any exposure to college or career or anything along those lines, right? So in a lot of ways, I think one of the most important things about dual enrollment is, of course, time to degree, college affordability, all those things, but it's this sort of very intangible piece of it, which is how do we start earlier in motivating, inspiring our students, provoking them to think about their own futures and imagining themselves there? So in a lot of ways, that's what dual enrollment, that's the promise of dual enrollment from a student perspective. From an institutional perspective, I think that we all see and feel in our guts that this is a moment of change. This is an inflection point. You see it in the data too. We see it in the enrollment patterns and the enrollment numbers. I think that one dynamic I see from the state level is in these periods of transition, a lot of people get very nervous. So it's like a big game of musical chairs, and no one wants to be the one who is left out. So there's this mindset of scarcity where everyone is just kind of trying to not be the last one standing. And in a lot of ways, dual enrollment is kind of like saying, okay, K-12, bring in your chairs. Post-secondary, bring in your chairs. Let's share our chairs, and let's make sure that everyone has a seat, which is a mindset of abundance, which is actually what we need to have when we're talking about real systems change. And so that's why right now is the exact perfect moment for dual enrollment, both from the perspective of we have on a mass scale students who are experiencing this almost existential question for themselves, and dual enrollment is one of the concrete policies that we can use to address those needs. But also at an institutional level, we're all kind of in flux right now. And so it makes sense to try to readjust the boundaries, see where more collaboration could be developed and implemented at scale. So that's why right now, and that's why it's so cool to see you all here right now.
So if you're looking for the tweetable moment, mindset of abundance is one of them. Thank you so much, Ben. Chris, my buddy, my friend, my colleague. EdTrust West has made dual enrollment among its educational priorities. It's one of the Equity 8 for your policy priorities. So why do you think this is particularly important in California right now?
Thank you, my friend. Good morning, everyone. My name's Chris Nellum. If you're not familiar with EdTrust West, we are a statewide advocacy organization, an evidence-driven advocacy organization. We've been in California 22 years. Our focus is to dismantle racial and economic barriers, which are, as many of you know, because you work to undo it every day, but those barriers are deeply woven into the education system in California. One of the reasons dual enrollment, of all the things we could care about, one of the reasons dual enrollment is on our agenda, there are three of them. One is focused on the racial barrier piece that I mentioned. This idea that individualism, so one of the reasons that high schools in our state exist is to prepare people to go to college. But we value this idea of individualism, this idea that you have to figure it out. And actually, we reward people who figure it out on their own, or who navigate systems that are not really clear, systems that actually need all people like you to make them better, to make them clearer. So one of the reasons dual enrollment is on our agenda is because that idea is a racial equity barrier. The idea that a system should not be set up to hold your hand, to help you along, to make sure that it's clear. So that's one of the reasons we care about dual enrollment, is because we don't think systems should be set up that way. We think they should actually facilitate access, come from a place of abundance, rather than trying to set up something like dual enrollment to be an elite opportunity for just a few. So that's one of the reasons. The other two reasons are that as an evidence-driven advocacy organization, one of the things we do is listen. We listen to people of color primarily around the state, and we were hearing from families and students that they were seeing this thing, dual enrollment, happen in their communities, but didn't really know why their kids, why our kids, were not considered ready, were not considered talented enough. And so we started to ask questions too about that. And the third reason is evidence. The evidence is clear. Young people who participate in dual enrollment, Ben just named all the outcomes: degree attainment, it's cheaper to go to college, continue to go on to college. And the other reason is that there is evidence that this can be an equity strategy, that it can be particularly important for students of color, and those are the folks who are central to our mission. So that's why dual enrollment is on our agenda. I think the underneath all of that is it can be an equity strategy. It is not currently. Only about 16%. Looking at my team, they're going to tell me I'm wrong, I'm sure. But I think 16% of Black students and just 17% of Latino students in the state have experience with dual enrollment. That's not enough. I think Sonia only Sonia for 30 days, just challenged us to make that 50% at least, if not more. And so we have work to do.
Thank you for that. Yes, we have work to do, and we've had all of these waves of reform that are helping us to do that work. And so that brings me to Linda. You've been an advocate and a leader in the community college system for many years. Standing back and reflecting on all of these successive waves of reform, what do you see as important insights, as well as some cautions, as we move to take dual enrollment to a larger scale?
Thank you. It's so great to look out and see all of you. And, I was sort of thinking, I knew this question in advance, and I was trying to think about it. And I want to pick up on something that you just said, Ben Cheetah, is that I think kind of underlying really successful reforms has to be a fundamental belief in student capacity. Mm-hmm. That is, we need to believe they can achieve, mm-hmm. and that it's our job to make it so. And that is a mindset shift that I think most of us have to work on. Speaking as a former teacher in a California community colleges, that belief is fundamental, and I'm sure it's true in K-12 as well. We have to rethink who is a college student. And as you're saying, Sonia, for a short time, everyone could be a college student. And every single one of the students need both college and career from the get-go, not one or the other. So I think that's something that's a growing set of perceptions. And I would also say, agreeing with you, Chris, that the end is really in the beginning. Because if we don't design from the get-go with a racial consciousness in mind, we're not going to change that data. We can't fix racial divides by not talking about race. And dual enrollment is up right now, and it's an incredible opportunity to reach out to Black and brown students, to low-income students, to first-gen students, and make that difference. I also think that we need to build on what we've already accomplished. I was thinking about those 8 years you showed of reform. That's incredible. And we've already done a lot. So we're not starting over. This is not a new initiative, not the next wave of the fancy reform. This has got to be integral. We've got to connect the dots across guided pathways, across community schools, across linked learning and career pathways, especially across remediation reform in the community colleges. We need to connect those dots and not start over. But we also need to take advantage not only of the dislocation of the pandemic, but of the real renaissance in activism around human capital, around racial justice, around gender justice, and around the concern for a shared prosperity in California. And we, I think, can only do that if we look at ourselves. Stop looking at what's lacking in the student, but we look at ourselves and say, what are we doing that's having these outcomes? What is it about our policies, our practices, our processes, our procedures that lead to these outcomes over and over and over again? How do we replicate inequity in the way that we do business? And that's where we need to start. And I also want to say that I think, in my experience, and I do speak as a former faculty leader, that a lot of the obstacles and the challenges that students face are really a lot more about the adults in the room than they are about the students. You know, the fear about teacher or faculty displacement has really hamstrung us. And if you look at a lot of the early legislation, there's all these kinds of convoluted things to protect faculty or teachers from displacement. But there's absolutely no evidence, and I'm glad to say, I think Craig and Bakersfield, you've done some work on this. There's absolutely no evidence of teacher or faculty displacement. So that attitude of abundance, I think, will work. And we need to get over ourselves just a little bit. I just want to say two quick things. One is I think the other part of dual enrollment that's really important, and we see it's kind of been neglected in former reforms, is the importance of community, of families. We have to call in and invite parents, and we're not used to doing that in community colleges. We're kind of like this with parents, right? But dual enrollment will require that, and in fact, we can strengthen it when we bring all the resources to bear. The community is essential to successful dual enrollment. And dual enrollment can be a game changer, Chris. It actually, not just for the student, but for the entire family. Because it changes the educational and economic trajectory of whole families and communities, especially in communities with low college-going rates that have historically been excluded from post-secondary. So that's the kind of dual enrollment we want to see.
Tweetable moment, get over ourselves. So this next set of questions I'm going to address to individual panelists, but I would like to invite all panelists to jump in. If you have something to add, please don't be shy. So Ben, the governor has delivered. This is like a really impressive investments from TK to 16 education, as well as a number of like intersecting workforce reforms. Like this is a lot of stuff. Community schools, K-16 collaboratives, Golden State Pathways, dual enrollment, like lots and lots of investment opportunities. Also a lot of plans, right? And so how do you see these things fitting together? And what advice might you have for the folks in the room to try to connect the dots between all these different investments?
Yeah, so I'll start with the what and the why, and then I'll get to the sort of the how. The what and the why, in a lot of ways, you know, one way I think about it is there's more or less $40 billion in new funds that are going towards really two big buckets, from cradle to career, TK to 16 and beyond, or really beyond, before TK to 16. But there's really two big buckets. The first bucket, and they both align to sort of what I think of as the questions that keep parents up at night. I also think about them in the context of like we're solving for Maslow's hierarchy, which is to say there's two big questions. Question one is the student safe? Are they well? Are they fed? All those things. And so that's why you see and that's our part of the agenda, a lot of our whole person, whole child, whole student work, which is around universal TK, universal after school, universal school nutrition. All those moves are really efforts to create safe, warm environments that wrap around students as early as possible, especially in those early grades, so that we're making sure that students have an opportunity to self-actualize. Like me, by the time I got to middle school, I was struggling with so much at home that I didn't really have an opportunity to think about my future. I was just really just trying to deal with the day-to-day stress. And I think part of our early education plays are really, really focused on how do we stabilize that as much as possible? How do we create that little cocoon as much as possible where students are safe and they feel like they can actually think about their future and there's an opportunity to actually be inspired. That second bucket is then the inspiration, which aligns with the question that, once you know that your kids are safe, they're fed, they're well, you ask them, what do they want to be when they grow up? You probably don't really have a very, in most cases, you probably don't have a very prescriptive view. You just want them to be happy. You want them to thrive. You want them to use, Maslow's framing. You want them to self-actualize. You want them to figure it out, right? And they want, and find and make meaning for themselves. So the second big category of investments that we made are things around dual enrollment, career pathways, our post-secondary compacts. It's really about the College Core. It's really about trying to create as many opportunities as possible for students to see themselves and what their futures might look like. The how is more the structural question in my mind, and I want you all to imagine like sort of a big stack, because that's what I always think of. A stack with a bunch of layers to it, right? So, if the implementation layer doesn't square up with the vision in the communications layer, the whole stack kind of falls apart. It doesn't actually deliver on what we need. And so imagine the stack with me. At the top, I kind of think of the 70% attainment goal, which you were asking about earlier, which is our overall goal to make sure that as many Californians as possible are set up for the future as we see it. Sonia had mentioned earlier, we set 3 priorities for job sectors: climate, education, and healthcare, because those are really the areas where we see really, really good jobs being available in the future, but also areas where if we don't build those workforces intentionally, we're not solving our state's and nation's biggest problems. And so we need to have that workforce there. So that's the sort of attainment goals and priority areas. And then below that is a bunch of stuff that we're trying to do at the state level to get people better coordinated. So the cradle-to-career data system, so that we have the tools and analytics and insights to actually be able to see what's working and what's not working. We have the compacts and the roadmap, which are an effort to get our post-secondary segments better aligned and coordinated. And then obviously have all these different programs. Below that is a new thing that we're trying to do, which is recognizing that California is not one big economy, but rather a bunch of regional economies that kind of develop organically. And so we marked out these 13 regions, roughly more or less, to try to figure out, okay, here are the clusters of people who are going to work together to align education and workforce systems with the community and region's future economic and employment needs, essentially. And so you have the Community Economic Resilience Fund and K-16 collaboratives, which are trying to create this coordination layer in this stack to get people aligned towards what the regional economies are going to be in the future. And then, of course, you see the counties and as Sonia was saying earlier, at the end of the day, all this gets implemented not in Sacramento, but actually on the ground. And so what I see is all these efforts to try to get as much coordination as possible so that we can unlock the energy at the implementation layer and actually get the energy rowing in the right direction. Going to the last part of your question, Naomi, it's like one of the most challenging things that I struggle with is I hear from you all I hear about all this money coming down, it's all great, but I'm not seeing a lot of it, or it's like, how do I connect the dots, or how do we braid these together, or that's being used over there, and that's not being siloed out over there. And so I think that for a lot of us right now, this sort of period is one in which, like I said, it's an inflection point where there's a bunch of stuff coming down, we have these new coordination efforts and sort of structures that we're trying to build out, and then really what we're trying to do is create this dialogue between government institutions writ large and students and families, and trying to get the what and the why of the vision that I was talking about Maslow, trying to get that moving through these different structural efforts to try to get our systems to change, aligning with the lived needs of students and families. So that's more or less sort of how we think about it. It's wildly complex, but it's also, I think, thankfully, one in which it's iterative and it's about co-creating this vision together over multiple years, because it's not going to be something that's just something that the governor just hands down from the top and just gets delivered, because we know that's not how anything ever works.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Chris, I have a similar question, right? So the dual enrollment grants have been, released, and people did their applications, and they're closed, and they're being read right now, probably by some folks in this room.
Yes.
And we're waiting with bated breath on the Golden State pathways to be released, those RFAs. So what do we, like the folks in this room, what do we need to do now to make sure that we're actually making the most of these investments?
Yeah, a couple of things come to mind. I hope that the money gets out soon, is one thing. So that's exciting. I think one of the things that's on my mind is that I hope we can all disabuse ourselves of the idea that a rising boat or rising tide lifts all boats. And I hope that the folks, I know all of you, I'm sure, are running really great dual enrollment early college programs, but I hope the programs or what gets funded are programs that recognize that fact. It's actually not an opinion. It's an observation of fact. This country, if you think about the Constitution, all the amendments are that. That is us as a country recognizing that a document that was intended to treat everyone equal wasn't, and needed to be better. The civil rights movement, by definition, was a movement that recognized that trying to treat everyone the same was not working. And so what I hope is that folks, as they prepare for these programs, that you recognize that and you do things with intention to make sure that these programs are equitable. And what that might look like is calling in, to Linda's earlier point, calling in, requiring that there's a family engagement component to your program, and not just requiring it, but valuing the fact that families bring so much richness to our students' lives. I think the other thing is to make sure that there are none of these silly artificial barriers, GPA or needing your principal's permission to take an early college course. And so I think the programs that are going to be best suited to move us forward as a state will get rid of those barriers and to make sure that dual enrollment is actually an equitable opportunity. The other is to get rid of, again, the silly competition, in my opinion, between K through 12 and higher ed, and partner. And so I hope that the programs that are funded come to the table. Like, sometimes getting K-12 folks and higher ed folks in the same room is like pulling teeth. And I hope that the programs that get funded are those that do that with ease and with intention. And I think the last thing on my mind is that these programs need to be uplifted as a equity strategy. And so your flyers, your outreach need to include students of color. They can do this work. Our organization for 22 years has been saying accountability is important. Our students can rise to the challenge. And so I hope that the dual enrollment programs that get supported or are primed for this opportunity are doing that. You can have spokespersons who are students of color who can share. I saw later in the program there's someone with like 60 credits already. I'm like, I was doing nothing in high school comparatively. But I think those are great examples of young people who can be spokespersons for your programs as you prepare.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. Yes. Let's lift up our amazing scholars who we already have and have them help out the next generation of scholars.
Yeah.
Linda, policy. Policy is super important. We've been talking a lot about policy, but implementation is also really important. How can we make sure that these two are mutually informing? We don't want, policy that is not informed by implementation is not very useful, and when there's great policy but it's not being implemented, so what, right? So we need them both. So how can we address some of the real barriers and pain points that practitioners encounter when they try and do this work?
Well, be careful what you ask for. I mean, a lot of policies that have been passed with all sorts of good intentions nonetheless go awry. But I do want to say I think there's been some really good policy passed in the last few years around dual enrollment in particular. And it's just a sea change. I don't know if any of you remember, but it used to be actually discouraged to do dual enrollment in California. There was a sort of suspicion that somehow we were double dipping or just taking advantage of it. And I think the work of Chris Holden, one of the leaders of the Black Caucus in the California legislature, was a sea change, as Sonia mentioned, with AB 288. But there's a lot more that needs to be done. And, we have the state here listening, so, have some hallway conversations, bring up the topics. I think one of the big issues, certainly from our perspective, is the issue of dual credit. Students should get credit where credit is due. So we need to fix that. And I think also there's a lot of guidance, to your point, about GPA. There's a lot of gatekeeping behavior that we engage in, often well-meaning. We think we're going to protect the students somehow from themselves. But in fact, a lot of the things we're doing are actually not legal according to Title V, and that GPA is one of them. You cannot keep people out of community college by looking at their GPA, and high school students taking dual enrollment are college students, and they're entitled to the rights thereof. So I'm looking forward to working with the Chancellor's Office and giving some guidance and additional emphasis to the Ed Code in that regard. But I also want to say not all of these barriers are at the state. Many of them are at the local level, and we can change them. Yeah, CCC Apply is a problem, but so are your local processes, and you can change them. And there are people in the room that have done that. I know Bakersfield is working with dualenrollment.com, and they've automated it. Imagine that. I mean, some of us are still using paper forms for students when we know that we're going and getting our home loans completely on DocuSign. That's not right in California, right? Some are using Quotely, which has been bought out by Parchment. I know the K16 Collaborative is doing some great work on a virtual hub. So there are solutions out there that we can act on. And by the way, while I think the state needs to do something about dual credit, right now it is a local policy, and it's determined by the school boards of the K-12 system. And if it's determined at the local level, we can change it. And I know the board members will really welcome your support and advocacy to change that policy at the local level. So we can do that now. I think a couple of times, both Chris and Ben have talked about, dual enrollment is really about taking joint responsibility for the young people in our communities. And that requires bringing together the K-12 and the community college system. And I think it's amazing to see that as we do that with faculty talking to faculty, teachers and faculty, counselors talking to counselors, that in fact we also build mutual respect and credibility for each other in the process, because teachers can teach community college faculty how to teach. And community college faculty can open incredible doors of expertise and resources in the disciplines that they bring to the table. And it's in that interchange that we can have this magic that happens. And I just want to say, because I'm looking out at all of you and kind of thinking, well, policy is one thing, but the emergent solutions that are going to work are here in this room, in the work of faculty, staff, teachers, classified professionals, administrators, leaders of all kinds that have been the ones generating the solutions, trying this out, having the courage to get rid of those that aren't working, pushing forward and generating the data that we need, the case making that we need. So I really want to say, a lot of that work is here at the conference in the breakouts. I urge you to go and exchange not only your challenges, but how you transcended them. And then also, we'll work with you to lift up what's working. Dual enrollment is not a panacea, right? It's great, it can be, but it's only going to work if we work together and we connect the dots across all of these different levels of initiative that Ben Chida was talking about. And I think that in this room in particular, we have the will, the brain trust, the experience, and the hope that it's going to take for us to do this. So I'm really proud of the work, and I'm really excited to be here with all of you.
So our panel is coming to a close. I'm going to throw out one more question, Kylie. Ben, I'm going to give you the last word. Any hints about what might be coming next?
Yes, I think it's worth kind of taking inventory of where we are, and at least this is from the governor's sort of office perspective of what our arc is. So I think from our perspective, the first 2 years of our administration were about problems bubbling up and then really overflowing once we got to the pandemic. The next 2 years were about, of course, managing sort of the pandemic, but also these 2 years of incredible just surpluses and investments that we could work off of and build off of and start to ideate off of. That's where we are right now. I would say where we are right now is the big challenge is lack of coherence and coordination. The big opportunity is the fact that we have all of this, you name it, there's a resource or there's energy or work happening against it. So that's where we are right now. I think in the next 2 years, as we've been really emphasizing with people, it's really about implementation, it's about creating that coherence, and you were saying it's about iteration. There needs to be dialogue between what is happening on the ground within that stack and also what is happening in Sacramento in terms of what's being adjusted. I think the last 2 years, or the last 2 or 3 years as we see it, is going to be about trying to cement as much of what's working as possible, trying to use our shared experience of all of this systems change and collaboration and creativity, and trying to figure out what can we codify and memorialize, and what can we do to revisit some of the foundations that we know haven't been revisited in a long enough time, and it's been too long. So I guess to make that specific to dual enrollment, I think to myself, we have a couple $100 million in one-time funds over 5 years to see how this works out. There's a number of ways that this could play out. To be real, if the $200 million, a couple $100 million disappears, and sort of we don't really have a very strong sense of what actually what outcomes generated off of those resources, then maybe that one time is over then. It's done. It was an experiment. It didn't work out. If dual enrollment is moderately successful, it's the sort of thing that we would want to turn into an ongoing program, a permanent fixture of what our community colleges and our K-12 systems are doing. But I think the most exciting part is if we're wildly successful, which I think everyone in this room is invested in, which is if we are wildly successful, what we're talking about is systems change at such a scale and a historic level where we're actually erasing the boundary between secondary and post-secondary, right? We're so used to talking about primary, secondary, post-secondary. We think through our own institutional hats and our own institutional lenses. We silo ourselves out that way. And really the big vision that we're trying to accomplish in California is to think not from our institutional perspectives and our own hats around like, well, this is a K-12 problem and that's a higher ed problem, so whatever. It's more like, let's sit with where the students and families are. Let's try to follow their journeys, cradle to career, and let's be agnostic as to which institution it is, and let's just try to pull everyone together, centering as much as possible on that journey, that lived reality, is really what we're trying to do. And so I think if we're wildly successful, that's what dual enrollment is really about. It's about really challenging the fundamental construct that we were all born into, that we all inherited, which is that there's this natural gap between secondary and post-secondary. And if you think about it, that just doesn't make much sense from a lived person's perspective. It didn't make sense for us as we were going through it. It didn't make sense for me. It doesn't make sense for our students now. So that's all to say, I think that there's a great deal at stake at this moment right now. It is a moment in which we have a certain type of abundance. There's a lot of resources to work off of. There's a certain type of scarcity and uncertainty about the future and nervousness about what this transformation and these structural changes will mean for my job or my role or my college or my institution. And so it is on us to try to collaborate as creatively as possible, see what works, and then before at least the Newsom administration is out the door, we want to be able to memorialize and codify as much as we can so that the next administrations moving forward can be set up for success, and that we're not all always banging our heads against the wall in terms of some of these institutional deficiencies that we've all lived with for far too long.
Please join me in thanking our amazing panelists. This has been fantastic. I'm so excited. I cried just a little bit when Ben was talking. And you will be able to hang out with them during a coffee chat. Yeah, this is really exciting. Panelists, if you'll do me the honor of standing up, and I'm going to grab my phone, and we're going to turn around and take a selfie with the crowd.
All right.
All right?
All right.
There you go.
Yes, let's hear it for our first panel. I hope you were writing down some of those quotes